Welcome back, first grade. Today we are going to learn about the people of the Nile. Our learning objectives for today are to review what a desert is and the importance of rivers, explain the importance of the Nile River to the Egyptians, demonstrate an understanding of the word flooding, and describe the idea of setting and illustrate a story that takes place on the Nile River. Our key vocabulary are advantage, enriched, flooding. Advantage is a noun, and an advantage is something that increases the chances of success. The children's small size gave them an advantage when playing hide and seek because they could hide in small places. Enriched. Enriched is a verb, and enriched means added to or made richer. Okay? Her mother bought milk that was enriched with vitamin D, meaning it had some extra vitamin D added to it. Flooding. Flooding is a noun, and flooding is a large amount of water covering an area that is usually dry. Sometimes when it rains very hard for a very long time, flooding takes place. All right, where is Egypt? So first, where is my continent of Africa? Where is the continent of Africa? It's this yellow part, okay? So that's the continent of Africa. And Egypt is a country in the northeast corner of Africa. Where's Egypt? Right here in the northeast corner of Africa. All right. What is a desert, and what are some adjectives that we could use when talking about the desert? So remember, adjectives are our descriptive words, meaning they are the words that we use to describe something. So tall, short, thin, thick, dark, light, hot, dry. Those are all adjectives. So what adjectives could we use when talking about the desert? Hot, pretty dry, right? Anything else you can come up with? All right. So much of Egypt, like Mesopotamia, is a desert. The desert in Egypt is called the Sahara Desert. Today, you're going to hear about life in ancient Egypt and an important river called the Nile River. The Nile River is the longest river in the world and it flows through Egypt. This is the Nile River. Okay. Have you ever heard of Egypt, the Nile River, or the Sahara Desert? Who remembers which two rivers were very important to the Mesopotamians and why they were important? The two rivers were the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, right? And they were important because they allowed the Mesopotamians to trade, grow crops, build reservoirs for drinking water and canals so they could get those that water to their land, right? All right, let's make some predictions. So at the same time people were living in Mesopotamia, people were also living in Egypt. The story that we will read today is about life in ancient Egypt several thousand years ago. This story is similar to the one with Wored, Idin, and Omor. It is factual information about Egyptians, but part of it is a made-up story with characters. Do you think that ancient Egypt was the same as or different from the life in Mesopotamia? So do you think that people living in ancient Egypt were living similarly or more different than the people who were living in Mesopotamia? Let's see if your prediction is right when we read, okay? So remember, our key vocabulary are advantage, enriched, and flooding. All right, I want you to listen carefully to learn about life in ancient Egypt and to find out whether or not your predictions are correct. Remember that ancient Egypt has been called the gift of the Nile, and I want you to listen carefully to find out why it was called the gift of the Nile. Here we go. While people were creating cities and nations in Mesopotamia, another group of people, the Egyptians, or people living in Egypt or people from Egypt, were building another great civilization on the banks of another river, the Nile. All right, so remember, here's Egypt down here, and Mesopotamia is up here. So these two rivers must be the Tigris and Euphrates, and this one must be the Nile. All right. The Nile River is the longest and one of the most mighty rivers on earth. So which river is the longest river in the world? The Nile. Very good. After it flows all the way through Egypt, it empties into the sea. The Nile has always given the people of Egypt a special advantage. There's your vocabulary word. Okay, the Nile was very helpful for the Egyptians. So most farmers outside of ancient Egypt, so over here in this like yellowy area, had a hard time growing crops. They often had to farm the same land year after year. The problem with this was that by using the same land every year, the crops they planted would use up the natural vitamins and minerals in that land. After the vitamins and minerals were used up, the farmers could no longer grow crops on that land. Because remember, guys, crops need vitamins and minerals to grow, right? So the farmers would have to stop farming and give the land a few years to rest, okay? By not growing crops on that land for a few years, the natural vitamins and minerals the plants needed to grow would start to build up again. Then the farmers could farm on that land again, at least for a few more years. Because the farmers could only grow their crops on the same land for a few years before the natural vitamins and minerals would be used up, they could not count on being able to grow enough food every single year. It was a very hard life. But the Egyptians, the people who lived here in the green area around the river, could farm the same land over and over again. Do you know why? The reason they could had to do with the Nile. All right. So the Nile begins its long journey to the sea in the high mountains of Central Africa. So Central Africa is over here, kind of in the middle. Every spring, heavy rainstorms fill Africa's mountain lakes, emptying water into the Nile. Rushing down the mountainsides with enormous speeds and power, the swollen river carries mud, rich with minerals and vitamins, in its current. A current is a continuous flow. Okay? When the flood waters reached the very flat lands of Egypt, they would spread out for miles on either side of the riverbanks. When the rains and the flooding stop, the river goes back to its usual size. So, when the water comes down, okay, it's coming down with a lot of power, so it's taking some of the mud with it. And it starts to, the river kind of expands, okay, and it's going to go over, kind of like it's overflowing, right? It's flooding into the surrounding land for a few miles, okay, and then eventually the flooding stops and the land goes back to being land, and the river goes back to its original path. Okay. Long, long ago, the ancient Egyptians planted crops in the muddy fields that were enriched with vitamins and minerals. So, do you see the crops and how close they are to the river? So, the river mud added vitamins and minerals to the fields during the flooding. Okay. In this way, the Nile floods meant life for the Egyptians. But if the rains were light for a year or two, the floodwaters would not bring enough rich soil with vitamins and minerals for the plants. And the people might go hungry because they would not be able to grow as much food. The Egyptians knew their lives depended on the river. Most Egyptians lived within 12 or 13 miles of the Nile on one side or the other, for it was there that the floodwaters refreshed the land each year. So I have a question for you guys. How is the Egyptians' dependence on the river similar to the Mesopotamians? So How is the way that the Egyptians are using the river similar or the same to the way that the Mesopotamians used their rivers? The Mesopotamians depended on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for water to support farming in the desert, just like the Egyptians are depending on the Nile, right? So they both need the rivers so that they can have rich soil with minerals and vitamins to grow their crops. Okay? The floodwaters could also be very dangerous. How do you think those floodwaters would be dangerous? People might drown, right? When the spring floods came, the Nile could destroy homes and villages if they were built too close to the river. So many ancient Egyptian villages were built up above the level of the river so that when the spring floods came, the river would not destroy the buildings and homes. Some villages, though, were built on the same level as the river itself. Every year, the people living there would have to leave their village when the water rose too high. Here, the word rose means moved upward or increased, not like a flower, okay? They moved away to a safer place and then would return a few weeks later after the river had returned to a lower level. The ancient Egyptians in those villages would have to repair a lot of the damage. Still, they did that every single year. Some villages had another way of dealing with the floodwaters. The people living in these villages dug canals, ditches cut into the earth, that spread from the edge of the river to carry away the extra water from the spring floods. Do you see the canal in this picture? It's right here. Okay. The water flowed through the canals past the village and into the farm fields beyond, so the village did not get damaged, and the water could be transported out farther from the Nile. Who else have you learned about who has dug canals? The Mesopotamians. And what did the Mesopotamians use those canals for? For farming, right? But the Egyptians used the Nile for other reasons, as we shall see in this story of an ancient Egyptian family. So, what do you think the ancient Egyptians used the Nile for in addition to farming? So, what other things do you think they used the river for? Let's see. You are now going to hear a story with the Nile River Valley as the setting. Remember, the setting is where where a story takes place. All right. One day, thousands of years ago, an Egyptian woman named Ipi and her daughter Mirit went down to the Nile to gather some soft, muddy clay so they could make clay pots. Approaching the river, they heard a voice called, "Ipi, Mire!" They looked up and smiled, for sailing out in the middle of the river was Renzi, the husband of Ipi and the father of Miri. Renzi was a fisherman who sailed his narrow boat up and down the river, casting out rope nets to catch fish. Renzi did this just as the men in his family had always done before him. As Renzi's mother had told him, once a fisherman, always a fisherman, and once a fisherman's son, always a fisherman too. The ancient Egyptians used Nile for food by fishing. Very cool, right? Renzi began making his way back to Miri and Ipi. After a few minutes, he reached shore, pulling his boat a little way onto the sand so that it would not drift back into the water. He made his way over to them. Miri turned to her father, who hugged her and kissed her. "Little fish," he said gently, using one of his nicknames for Miri. The three of them took the rope fishing nets from the boat and hung them to dry on the wooden racks in the sun. Then Renzi, his wife, and his daughter took the fish from the boat back to their village, where they would sell them at the market. The river was an easy way to transport people and goods. How is this similar to Mesopotamia? They did the same thing in Mesopotamia too, didn't they? That night, exhausted from a day at the market, they made their way back to their little house made of mud bricks at the end of the village. All right, guys, that's the end of that story. So if you need to hop up and grab a wiggle break and or a snack, go ahead and do that and then come back for our questions. All right, so what continent is Egypt located on? Africa. And why is Egypt often called the gift of the Nile? It's called the gift of the Nile because the Nile River allowed the Egyptians to do um, what they needed to do, right? So ancient Egypt was able to be established as a civilization because the river was there. If they didn't have the river, then they wouldn't be able to be a city because they wouldn't have been able to have their farming or their homes because they wouldn't have enough food, right? So the the Nile is like a gift, okay, to the ancient Egyptians. All right. Why did most people in ancient Egypt live near the Nile River? They needed to grow their own food, and the river made farming possible. How was the flooding of the Nile, which happened during heavy spring rains, important for farming? How was it a good thing? Because it enriched the soil with vitamins and minerals, right? Because when when the powerful or heavy rains would happen, the mud would come down with it, and that mud had had enriched soil, so really good vitamins and minerals, and then that flooding would spread the good mud with all the minerals and vitamins into the ground where the Egyptians were growing their crops. Okay. So, were your predictions about whether life in ancient Egypt was the same as or different from the life in Mesopotamia correct? How are Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt the same? They were both located near rivers, and people lived in both places. And both people had canals, right? How are they different? Well, they were on different continents, and the rivers had different names. And in Egypt, flooding played a big role, right? Do you think that ancient Egypt could have existed without the Nile River? There's no right or wrong answer. I don't really think it would. I just think that it would be too hard for them to have the food that they would need. All right, let's get to our word work. So, in the read aloud, you heard, when the rains and the flooding stop, the river goes back to its usual size. I want you to say the word flooding with me. Flooding. Can you say it in a whisper voice? Flooding. How about in a mouse voice? Flooding. How about in a monster voice? Flooding. So, flooding means a large amount of water covering an area of land that is usually dry. I heard on the news that there was flooding near the Mississippi River. Have you ever seen or heard about flooding? Try to use the word flooding when you tell about it. What's the word we've been talking about? Flooding. All right. So the read aloud explained that flooding was helpful to the ancient Egyptians because it enriched the soil. Flooding can also be harmful because too much water can damage plants, animals, and homes. I'm going to read some sentences. If the sentence describes a way that flooding can be helpful, you're going to say, flooding can be helpful. If the sentence describes a way that flooding can be harmful, I want you to say, flooding can be harmful. All right. The flooding provided rich soil for planting crops. Flooding can be helpful, right? The people living near the river had to leave their homes as the flooding came closer and closer. Flooding can be harmful, right? It's going to destroy their homes. The flooding left clay that was used to make clay pots. That's helpful, right? So flooding can be helpful. The birds flew away because of the flooding of their habitat. Flooding can be harmful. The flooding destroyed the corn crop. Flooding can be harmful. Sorry, guys, for the background noise. The animals are having a party, I guess. All right. So what did you learn about farming along the Nile? What did you learn? That it was a good thing, right? It helped them. That's why they were able to grow crops, right? And we already talked about how it was similar to Mesopotamia and how it was different. All right. So where would we put this? What would we put this picture of? What would we put this picture under? Would we put it under leaders, farming, um, religion, writing? Well, what would we put? Or cities? Which would we put it under? Farming, right? Because look, they're growing crops. Okay. All right. So what is a setting? A setting is where a story takes place, right? And what was the setting of today's story? Along the Nile River in Egypt, right? I want you to draw a picture of this setting, of the setting of this story, and then I want you to just write a sentence describing what you drew, okay? And I want you to take a picture and send it to me. So let's review our objectives. Did we talk about what a desert is and why rivers can be important? Yes. We were able to explain the importance of the Nile River to the Egyptians. Yeah. We were able to understand the word flooding. Yes. And in a second, you're going to draw the setting and write a sentence about it, right? All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Bye.